And what motivates me is probably the idea, when we talk about water, for me, it's amazing how water connects everything. So that's for me something that blew my mind. Like the water really connects everything. It connects health, climate, energy, food production, biodiversity, social justice, economic opportunity. And in a country like Brazil, with such immense natural size, but also with deep inequalities, this universal access to water and sanitation is about dignity and development also. So I think that's it. My North Star, you asked me before, what's your North Star when you talk? It's really helping to build institutions and policies.
Welcome to Investing in Regeneration. This podcast is about changing how we understand, plan, and finance projects so that finance becomes a driver for better decisions, not just the last step in the process. In each episode, we unpack a real deal or initiative through three lenses: understanding, planning, and financing. We explore how it came about, who worked together, and what needs to change for these innovations to become mainstream. Because the real bottleneck is not capital. It is how investments are originated, structured, and brought to bankability. Our financial systems can do more than financing change. They can help shape it. Welcome to Investing in Regeneration. Today, I'm delighted to welcome Ana Carolina Argolo. Ana Carolina is a director at the National Water and Sanitation Agency of Brazil, ANA, and former World Water Council governor. She has a geology graduate from the University of Brasilia with a postgraduate degree in environmental management and technologies from the University of Sao Paulo, and in environmental geoprocessing from the University of Brasilia. And I believe you're now also studying economics, but we can talk about that in a moment. And previously to being in ANA, she served as a director at the Department of Sustainable Development in Mining of the Secretariat of Geology and Mineral Transformation at the Ministry of Mines and Energy of Brazil. She holds great experience in environmental consulting, geological risk management, and water availability in aquifers in the private sector. Well, welcome, Ana, to Investing in Regeneration, transforming planning and financing through system thinking. As we have discussed before, I'm a firm believer, as stated by Paul Hocken in his book Regeneration, that ending the climate crisis within one generation requires addressing a much deeper root cause, because the root cause of global warming is a massive disconnection, right, between each other, between people and nature, and even within nature itself, caused mostly by humans, like pollution, fragmentation, and degradation. And so regenerating and reversing this damage in this crisis is really about reconnecting those broken strands. That is what the real solutions are, as opposed to standalone techniques and technologies trying to fix a problem with one single option. And so that's why today and in each episode, we unpack the entire investment cycle and dive deep with the leaders behind pioneering investment programs, funds, or initiatives through three lenses: understanding, planning, and finance. And that's what we will do today with you. We will explore how the new water framework of Brazil has been developed. And before we start on that, I want to say, for the people who are not so much into the water sector and also do not know Brazil, that Brazil is one of the most water-endowed countries in the world. Its ecosystems not only sustain national water security for the country, but for the world, because you hold 12% of the fresh water endowment of the world. And so in that way, you influence global water systems also through what we name now green water or flying rivers, right? That goes to other countries. There was a recent report, in fact, that came out that said that Brazil, Indonesia, and the countries that sewer the Congo Basin together, those forests, they export around 4,000 cubic kilometers per year to other countries, which, according to this report of the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, is equal to the entire freshwater consumption of the world. So to me, it's a great honor to have you, who are at ANA, and dive deep into Brazil's new water and sanitation framework. So we will explore how you're strengthening the understanding of the sector, of the private sector especially, about water, shaping new investment opportunities through planning and enabling new financing models. And I would dare to say, and you can correct me here, but as one of the few agencies in the world that regulates the entire water cycle, like from source to sea. Your work sits at the heart of a deeply complex and systemic challenge, water security and resilience for Brazil and the world. So I'm particularly looking forward to discuss the role of the public sector in enabling this paradigm shift towards regeneration, because as you have explained me too in the preparation, is that transformation is not about a single project. It is about a national investment agenda supported by institutional reforms that started since 2020 and achieved from a fragmented sector towards a more coordinated investment-oriented model for the provision of water, sanitation, and hygiene. So I'm very excited because what we will talk with you today is about achieving universal access to water and sanitation, improving the well-being of communities across Brazil, and strengthening water security not only for Brazil but globally. Now, tell us about Brazil's new water and sanitation sectoral framework. Could we dive with you into the recently adopted legal framework? Could you tell us more about it? What are the main objectives, pillars, and principles of this framework?
Yes. First of all, thank you, Mónica, so much for this invitation and for the opportunity to be part of this conversation. It is truly a pleasure to join you today. And I would also like to congratulate you for the initiative behind this podcast. And I think this podcast comes at a very important moment globally when we are realizing that discuss about infrastructure, finance, climate, and development cannot happen in isolation anymore, how in the past. So I'm gonna talk about this new moment of Brazil in the water and sanitation sector. This framework represents one of the most important institutional reforms in Brazil's infrastructure sector in recent decades. The legal framework of water and sanitation was approved in 2020 and was created with a very clear mission. What is the mission? To accelerate universal access to safe drinking water and sanitation services in Brasilia by 2033. Before the reform, the sector was highly fragmented. So we had thousands of municipalities with very different regulatory capacities, contract models, and investment conditions. And this created uncertainty, low efficiency, and a very hard difficulty in attracting long-term capital. So the reform introduced three major shifts. First, it straightened legal and regulatory certainty to a more standard national framework. Second, reinforced a regionalization and the scale, allowing municipalities to work together and create more viable investment structures. And third, it expanded the role of the agency in issuing national reference standards for regulation and governance. So the idea is not decentralized regulation, but coordinated regulation. And Ana creates reference standards to improve the consistency, the transparency, and the predictability across the country. And ultimately, the framework seeks to combine social inclusion, environmental sustainability, and economic viability. Water and sanitation are not only infrastructure services. They are public health, dignity, climate resilience, and long-term development.
Thank you so much. And in that sense, that's what the regeneration approach is about looking at the climate crisis, but weaving in the human dignity, social justice, nature, also nature regeneration, right? With that, I would like to ask you, and I think it's incredible. I noticed that you have three major shifts. So a standardization in regulatory frameworks, regionalization and scale so that you can pool projects and in a way lower transaction costs through coordination, and the expanded role of Ana as setting the standard. So as you say, from a fragmented to a coordinated regulatory approach, right? And so now, what role does the private sector play in this new framework? And what is the approach that you have for the provision of water and sanitation services? And which other actors play a crucial role?
Okay. So The private sector plays an important role, okay, but not an isolated one. So what Brazil is building is a collaborative model where public authorities, regulators, operators, developed banks, investors, and civil society all have complementary responsibilities. So that's very important to say. So the private participation is fundamental to help mobilize the scale of investment required for universalization. Brazil still faces enormous infrastructure gaps, and public resources alone are not enough to close them. But the framework is not about privatization and in itself. It's about improving services delivery, increasing investment capacity, and ensuring long-term resilience and accountability. So the public sector remains essential. There, it's very important because the public sector is important, especially in planning, regulations, social protection, environmental governance, and ensuring that the universal access remains the core of the objective. Institutions like banks, like the BNDES, regional development banks, state governments, municipalities, regulators, and international partners also play a crucial role in structuring projects and reducing risks. So in many ways, the framework is about building institutional coordination and trust across different actors.
Great. And I think as you were explaining, right, and we will come back to that, you are actually explaining that one of the regenerative design principles that is in right relationship. So it's bringing all actors in right relationship to each other so that they can contribute with their strengths, right? And I think it has been really good that you say it's not about privatization. It is the private sector plays a great role in delivery, efficiency, but it's the public sector who will hold also the accountability that you need for this to work long term. Well, now let's go to the final question regarding this section on when we discuss the initiative, which is Brazil New Water and Sanitation Sector Framework. And the question is, could you walk us through the theory of change and impact pathway that you foresee and you had in mind when you developed this new regulatory and legal framework? And if possible, mention some of the effects you have already seen from the time that the law was and the sectoral framework was adopted.
Okay, the theory of change is actually very systemic. The assumption behind the reform is that if you improve governance, legal certainty, planning capacity, and regulatory coordination, you create a more predictable environment for long-term investment. And when investment increases, infrastructure expands. When infrastructure expands, you improve public health, environmental protection, water security, and social inclusion. So since the reform, we have already seen significant movement in the sector. Brazil was attracted tens of billions of dollars in contracted investments through concessions and public-private partnerships since then. We also see increased professionalization, better projects structuring, and more attention to long-term performance indicators. At the same time, challenges remain enormous. Brazil is a continental country with very unequal realities, so implementing capacity is still uneven across the regions in Brazil. But what is also important is that the sector now has a clearer direction, a stronger institutional coordination, a long-term targets that are helping to align public and private actors around a common agenda. So we see these changes happening, and we know that there is a process, and we are monitoring the effects of the new law for now 6 years.
Thank you so much. I think what I would like to take of the theory of change, which you explained very clearly, right? Like how you see each of these changes that you did leading to predictability, to then investments in infrastructure, closing the gap in access, and therefore improving social inclusion and the well-being of the communities, is that you are saying that you have clear vision towards where you want to get, right? By 2033, clear targets, and that has enabled, along with the regulatory and legal clarity, the alignment of interest. And I think that's key. And it sounds like in that way, you're actually really creating all the conditions for these investments to happen at scale, right? Now, we will go to another part, which is one of the part that I'm very much interested, because I know that behind these changes that take a lot of political will and courage and hard work, there are people, courageous leaders that have a personal commitment to make a better place of the country or the region where they work. And I had the pleasure to meet you, Carolina, in Costa Rica during the Latin American Regional Water Dialogues back in 2024. And I have followed your trajectory ever since. I'm really admire the work that you are doing at ANA. Could you tell us more about yourself? What do you work on in ANA, but also why are you doing that? How did you come to decide to give so much of your time and efforts for water and universal access to water and sanitation and hygiene?
That's a hard question, Monica. Okay, today I serve as the director at ANA, that is the National Water and Sanitation Agency of Brazil. And today my work involves strategic decision making related to water resource management, sanitation regulation, water security, and also with institutional modernization of the agency. One of the most interesting aspects of ANA is that we work across the entire, you told this, and I love it that you told that we really work across entire water cycle. So our discuss range from water allocation and drought resilience to sanitation regulation, dam safety, data governance, and climate adaptation. And with this new sanitation framework, we have a role that is especially important to national reference standards and have to improve the regulatory quality. I also say a large part of my role in ANA today is helping to connect the technical regulation with the broader public policies objectives, including universal access, resilience, sustainability, and long-term investment confidence. In my background, I don't know if I can just
Of
already
course,
say
yes. No, say it.
my background is actually a geology. I'm a geologist, and I have always been very connected to the territory.
Okay.
So I have a few years, like 10 years working. I had 10 years working in the territory as a geologist. And I'm always was interested in water, in natural systems, and in the relationship between the society and the environment. That's always drive me to the point of these issues. I started my career working in environmental consulting. I worked a lot with geology risk management, especially I work a lot with water availability and environmental licensing of infrastructure projects. So it's something that I love to do and I am passionate about. And that experience gave me a very practical understanding of how environmental issues directly affect people's lives in economy development.
Yes.
So I think that background make me get more and more interested in studies of environmental in general, okay? And I work a lot with underground water too. And it was this knowledge that make me be able to be at ANA today. And then over time, I become increasingly interested in public policy also and institutional transformation. How the governments can create better systems, better governance, and more long-term solutions. And what motivates me is probably the idea when we talk about water. For me, it's amazing how water connects everything. So that's for me something that blew my mind. Like the water really connects everything. It connects health, climate, energy, food production, biodiversity, social justice, economic opportunity. And in a country like Brazil with such immense natural size, but also with deep inequalities, this universal access to water and sanitation is about dignity and development also. So I think that's it. My North Star You asked me before, what's your North Star when you talk? It's really helping to build institutions and policies and create long-term public value, balancing the environmental protection with the social inclusion, the sustainable development. I think is something that
Yeah.
drives me, that
Wow.
work.
I understand now how working as a geologist very close to the territories already gave you that live experience that all of these things are connected, right? And very concrete indication of how these decisions at top level impact the lives of people. And I think it's really great. And water indeed is like a reminder that everything is connected. And that's how our systems should also evolve towards that understanding. Now, I would like you to tell us more about, for example, investments in water, sanitation, and hygiene, which different parties make part of that, of achieving that universal access, which roles and stakeholders play a crucial role to make it a success and sustainable over time. Are they different also in the different phases? You see, when you're planning for water resources or master plans for cities and then really implementing a wastewater treatment plan or a wetland recovery or whatever you might regulate from Ana.
Well, achieving universal access in a country as large and diverse as Brazil requires much more than a single investment or a single institution. It really depends on coordination across an entire ecosystem of actors. One of the most important aspects of the new framework is precisely that it creates a more organized and collaborative environment for long-term investments. At the federal level, the government defines the broader public policy direction and long-term universalization goals. ANA plays a strategic role by issuing national reference standards that improve regulatory quality, governance, transparency, predictability to the sector. But the implementation happens very locally. Municipalities remain central actors because under the Brazilian Constitution, they are the holders of the water and sanitation services. So states also become increasingly important, especially through our regionalization models that help to create the scale and improve projects' viability. Another actor that's, of course, very important are the operators, both public and private. The operators are fundamental for expanding the infrastructure, improving operational efficiency, and delivering the services over time. And we have the financial institutions that also play a key role. Okay, so institutions like BNDES have been extremely important in projects preparation and structuring, helping to reduce the transaction costs and improve the bankability. We also see growing participation from private investors, commercial banks, and multilateral institutions. And I think that is important to highlight that the civil society, the regulators, the environmental agencies, and the communities themselves are also essential stakeholders in the sector. Water and sanitation investments only become sustainable if they maintain public legitimacy, generate long-term social value. What is interesting is that the role of these actors evolve throughout the investment cycle. In planning, in the planning and origination phase, the public sector tends to play a stronger role, especially in strategic planning, the regulation, in the project preparation, and the risk structuring. During the procurement and financing, investors, operators, and financial institutions become more prominent because issues like contract clarity, risk allocation, and financial sustainability become critical. In the operational phase, regulation, monitoring, environmental resilience, and community engagement become essential to sustain the quality of the services over the decades. So ultimately, universal access is not only an infrastructure challenge, it's also a governance challenge. Yeah? And I believe that the new framework helped Brazil to move from this fragmented model toward a more coordinated investment-orientated, and long-term vision for the sector.
Beautiful. I mean, I can see from every response that you give me that basically your framework has been creating those connections and bridges between all the actors and giving clarity to the roles they can play so that they can together be more than the sum, right? And instead of like maybe competing or working against each other interests. So you have already mentioned some of that, but if you could tell me very brief, what is ANA mandate in the new framework? How does ANA and the new framework influence the process of identifying what to invest in, the investment origination, and structuring kind of the shape that it can take versus the situation before the framework?
Perfect. So ANA's mandate expanded significantly because the legal framework, historically, the agency has already responsible for national water resources management, okay? But with the new framework, ANA also become responsible for issuing these reference standards for the sanitation regulation. And this is a very important institutional innovation for Brazil. Because before 2018, the sector was highly fragmented. We have thousands of municipalities, many different regulatory approaches, very heterogeneous contracts, and significant legal and regulatory uncertainty. In many cases, investors face difficulties understanding the rules, accessing risks, and comparing opportunities across regions. This fragmentation increased transaction costs and often delayed or even prevented investments from moving forward. What the new framework and ANA expanded mandate aim to do is create a greater consistency, predictability, and transparency across the sector. It's important to say that ANA does not directly regulate local tariffs or individual contracts. Instead, we issue references, standards, and best regulatory practices related to areas such as tariff regulation, governance, service quality, efficiency, contractual mechanisms, and universalization targets. This helps to create a more stable environment for investment, origination, and project structuring. In practical terms, investors and operators today have clearer parameters, more standardized governance expectation, and a stronger legal certainty than before the reform. Another important aspect is that the alignment with ANA standards become connected with something that is very important, get to the access to certain federal funding mechanisms.
Yeah.
So this created incentives to convergence and improved regulatory coordination across the country. I would say that before 2019, many projects were developed in a much more isolated and uneven way. And today we have gradually building a more mature investment ecosystem, one that combines local realities with national coordination. And this is the role of ANA. And this is essential because water and sanitation investments are very long-term investments, and they require trust, institutional stability, and predictability over decades, not just over years.
Great. I love how you have clearly explained that there is not a dichotomy between empowering and giving a role to the local institutions to shape this investment, but at the same time, creating that ecosystem and that regulatory clarity and coordination layer needed for these long-term investments to be successful and to take place. Now, just very shortly, normally, what would be the process between identifying that there is need, for example, for a new wastewater treatment plant somewhere, and that being implemented on the ground? How was that before? And do you see a change that in those times because of the new framework?
Yeah, I think the principal change is the contracts. So before the framework, we have the contracts wasn't very clear. So to an operator or for us to invest in a new treatment plant, for him to invest this kind of money was very hard because he had no legal security, high risks to do that. And today, after the new law, the first thing is adjust the contract, put the risk management inside the contract, adequate the contracts. That way, the investor have more security to improve the service. So I think more we're gonna discuss about the time.
Yes.
It took so much more time in the past to put a project
in place
in the field. Yeah, because it was a very high risk.
Yeah, very, very adventurous journey involved, and now it's much more clear. And so, going on that, I mean, now it has been, we in 2026, this was adopted around 6 years ago, I understand. What are the lessons learned or tips you have for investors and investees regarding the origination and strategic planning phase for investments in water security? So, before the investment happens, which is what we will talk in the next phase on the financing, this part of creating the enabling environment, but also shaping good quality projects. What have you learned through this process? What would you recommend other countries working on this? Also around the ideal role, public versus private sector, and even if you want to go also on the skills that you need as public sector agencies like Anna at the national level, but also at the local level.
What I see in those 6 years of new framework and being a director in Anna, and I have the opportunity to start my journey in Anna when the law was very new and we are building the capacity to do these standards and monitoring the sector to see how the sector will respond to the regulation and to the new framework. What I see is that, first of all, it was a very courageous step because, of course, we had the sanitation sector that was the ugliest child of the infrastructure sector here in Brazil. Okay, the orphan that no one wants to mess with that because you know. And what I see in this time is that the sector wants that. The sector wants to renovate. The framework is something that the sector needed and wants. Something that is very interesting is that the sector are building, from the point of view of Ana, the sector are building these standards with the agency. And when I say the sector, it's all the actors. And of course, that at some point that makes a lot of people happy, a lot of people unhappy. But we can discuss that is something that everybody wants, the universalization of the service. And everybody knows that we don't have in the old model the capacity to build that without investor and without a change of the regulation, okay? So what I see is that the lessons learned is that we have to have the legal security. We have to have the regulation that works. We have to have this connected environment where we have the operator and the agencies that make the regulation, the federal government with the municipalities, with the states together to make it work.
Reading what you told me also through the regeneration approach, and also what I think is the future is that you have set clear the mission, right? And the goal that you want to achieve in the long term. And knowing that's the mission to get universal access, sanitation, you have worked with the whole sector to get to how do you do that and build that understanding for them to know that change has to happen if they want that to happen. Okay, now I would like to go to the financing model, right? The financing aspect, the instruments, blended finance components. So as we move into the more technical and financial aspects of the framework, could you briefly describe the different investment and contracting structures that are foreseen in the new framework? And how is that different from the situation before the framework?
Okay. One of the major transformations brought by the new framework was precisely the creation of more structured and diversified investment environment for the sector. So before 2019, the Brazilian works in sanitation was what I told before, very highly fragmented. Many services contracts were established, brought direct agreements between municipalities and state-owned companies, often without competitive processes, with very different governance standards and limited incentives for the efficiency or long-term investment planning. This created the significant asymmetries across the country and made it difficult to attract large-scale private capital or structure long-term investment pipelines. The new framework introduced a more organized and investment-oriented model. Today, we see different types of contractual and investment structures coexisting in the sector. So we have a different types. Traditional public service provision still exists and continues to be important in many regions. But we also have a growing number of concessions and public-private partnerships, especially regionalized models that combine multiple municipalities to create economic scale and improve financial viability. These structures can include full concessions, where private operators assume long-term responsibility for investment and operations, or PPPs models, where these responsibilities and risk are shared between public authorities and private operators. So we also see strong participation from blended financing arrangements involving the development banks, commercial banks, multilateral institutional guarantees, and technical assistance mechanisms. Another important evolution is the increasing sophistication of the project's preparation and risk allocation. That is a big evolution in the sector. And I think this is one of the biggest difference compared to the pre-2019 scenario. The reform was not simply about increasing the private participation, was not just about it. It was really about improving the governance, the legal certainty, the regulatory coordination, and everything. And today, the investors have clearer rules, have standards, contractual expectations. The investors have better defined universalization targets and a stronger targets and a stronger regulatory reference that Ana is building. So the sector gradually is moving from this fragmented and uncertain environment to a more mature environment of infrastructure investment.
Once you were explaining how all these different models have, from traditional public, traditional delivery by the public sector all the way to concessions, could you very shortly say what are factors that play a role sometimes when you decide what would be the best model for a particular challenge or region? Are there a couple of these factors that help you, find out what would be the best model?
And when you say model, is a public or a private model?
Yeah, or for example, is it a concession or is it a public-private partnership where the government based on performance? Does the private sector take the market risk, or it remains traditional? Is there a logic that helps people choose the fit-for-purpose arrangements? Yes.
So it's basically an arrangement, a political arrangement of these states that will make studies and decided if what part of the state will be private or what municipality is going to be part of a concession or what part will be just the public that will attend that area. So we have here a lot of examples where we have states when we have part of the state is in a concession and part of the state have municipalities that are public with the public service directly. So
it could be related also to like incomes of the people or historic situations, or it's a negotiation. I understand.
I think it's a negotiation, and I think that is not directly connected with for example, what you said, like the type of public that we will attend. For example, we have right now a new contract and a concession that I think the most recent is from the state of Pará. I don't remember if Pará is where Belém, where happens the COP.
Yes.
Remember?
Yes.
Yeah. And it's one of the states that have the lowest numbers of coverage in water and sanitation of Brazil. The numbers are very, very low, and it's very sad. And they just have an auction, né? It's a leilão.
Auction, yes.
Yeah. And now there's a big company that is a company that have a role in another very richer states in Brazil. The auction and is there to operate and create. And so that is not a direct connect. That's not directly connection, you know?
Okay,
Yeah.
I understand. No, thank you. That's really helpful. Now, when we look to the new sectoral framework, and from the perspective of principle 1, that is called in right relationship. And that is explained by the Capital Institute, who has developed these principles like humanity is an integral part of an interconnected web. There is no real separation between us and it. The scale of the human economy matters in relationship to the biosphere in which it is embedded. So if we look at that in right relationship, can you tell us briefly how the new investment framework impacts how investments in water and sanitation and ultimately freshwater ecosystems are perceived by the private sector? How this is creating a better understanding between the interdependence between social and environmental health and economics prosperity?
I think one of the most important shifts promoted by the new framework is that the water sanitation are increasingly no longer seen only like a traditional infrastructure sector. I think this is something that is one of the most important shifts, because right now when you talk about sanitation, clearly in Brazil, not just for the society, but also for the government, they are being understood as a foundational system for economic resilience, environmental stability, and social well-being. So historically, many investors view it, the sanitation, with the utility perspective of tariffs, infrastructure, but today is growing the understanding that water security and healthy freshwater access systems are directly connected to the economic productivity, public health. And we see this speech also in the politics, making because before it was hard to understand what the sanitation makes difference in the health costs, in the girls' lives, in the performance in the school of the kids. This dignity, they're looking for sanitation like something that gives dignity for people.
Yes, human dignity.
And I think that the new framework bring more light for that.
That's amazing. And I will go also now to principle number 2, right? Which says we views health holistically. True wealth is not merely money in the bank. It must be defined and managed systemically in terms of well-being of the whole, right? And so to what extent the new framework advanced this more holistic view of wealth for Brazilians and enable the activation of a new way of investing that considers not only financial capital, but natural and social capital?
I think the new framework contributes to a broader and more holistic understanding to wealth, precisely because it helps reposition water and sanitation as foundation system for societal well-being, not simply as utility services. Traditionally, the investment in the sector were often evaluated mainly through a narrow financial lens, but the universal access to water and sanitation produce value that goes far beyond the direct financial performance. It improves public health, like I said, reduces healthcare costs, protects freshwater systems, increase productivity, support education, strengthens climate resilience, reduce inequality. In many vulnerable communities, access to water and sanitation is directly connected to dignity, opportunity, and social inclusion. So the framework gradually encourages a shift from a view of infrastructure purely as a financial access toward understanding it as a generator of multiple forms of capital financial,
Okay.
social, environmental, institutional. I don't know if I
Yes,
answered
it's
correctly,
perfect.
but
No, of course. I mean,
yeah.
and congratulations, but that you have managed that. That is even in the speech of political representatives, right? To embrace that, because that's the understanding that becomes first. You can plan the investments and finance them. And so
Yeah.
now, when we look about principle number 5, honors community and place, we believe that our regenerative economy nurtures healthy and resilient communities and regions, each one uniquely informed by the essence
Yeah.
of its individual history and place. So, Brazil is a very large country with very different settings. We know that water security and adaptation measures need to be adapted to the context. And because you have as a geologist work, in a specific territory also, how do you balance, in the one hand, the idea that you honor the differences between
Uh-huh.
regions, geographical differences, but also cultural heritage or starting point, with the need to standardize, to reduce transaction costs, but also increase capital flows towards the goal of universal access?
Okay. Yeah, Monica, this is actually one of the central challenges in implementing the water sanitation policy in Brazil. Brazil is, how you say, it's almost a continent. We have
Yes.
enormous regional diversity in terms of climate, in hydrology, ecosystem, urbanization patterns, institutional capacity, income levels, and cultural realities. The challenges of water security in Amazon are completely different from those in the semi-arid Northeast, the industrial Southeast, or the Pantanal wetlands. So, any successful framework needs to recognize that there is no single solution that fits the entire country, obviously. At the same time, the excessive fragmentation creates inefficiencies, uncertainty, and a very high transaction costs, which ultimately make investments more difficult and expensive. So the balance we try to achieve is what I would call standardization of principles, not homogenization of realities. Okay?
Wow.
The role of institutions like ANA is to create the common reference standards for governance, transparency, regulatory quality, and legal predictability, because investors and operators need a minimum level of consistency. So
Yes.
our paper is put the minimum level of consistency and trust across the system. But the implementation itself must remain adaptable to the local conditions. So, for example, tariff structures, technological solutions, even governance arrangements may need to be different significantly depending of the regional realities or the local vulnerabilities. I think the regionalization was an important innovation precisely because it tries to reconcile these dimensions. It creates scale and coordination to improve investment viability while still preserving the local participation and the territorial specificities. And I would say that respecting place is not only a cultural or social issue, it's also a technical necessity.
Yeah.
So water systems are deeply territorial. They depend of the the ecosystems, the watershed, the climate and everything, the demographic dynamics. So if we ignore the local realities in favor of purely standardized financial models, we may reduce the transaction cost in short term, but we can create much larger social, environmental, and operational risk over time if we ignore these realities, right? So ultimately, resilience comes from combining the institutional coordination with this local adaptability. And I think the framework is helping Brazil to move to this kind of balance.
That's really great. I love that you say standardization of principles, but not homogenization of realities. And that this is one of the crucial dilemmas or balances that you have to strike. And I see that in all these problems around nature regeneration, climate adaptation,
Yeah.
that's the key. Also, that you mentioned that to adapt is not just because you want to acknowledge cultural heritage and social preferences, but it is a technical necessity too, right? To be effective in the long term. Now, going to the last principle, and that we will be very short about that because I want to get to the final question. But principle number 8 is about dynamic balance, okay? And that's achieving harmony requires balancing paradoxes with both and thinking rather than either or. And so when we talk about private participation in water, we both know that it's quite a polarizing topic. How does the new framework manage to balance the achievement of public value while leveraging private sector participation and investment?
So, yes, you're right. The private sector participation in water and sanitation is often a very sensitive and polarizing discussion globally because water is not just another economic asset, it's a fundamental human necessity. And I think one of the most important aspects of Brazilian framework is precisely that it tries to move beyond the simplistic public versus private debate. So the question is not whether services are provided by the public or the private operations. The real question is whether the institutional model is capable of delivering the universal access, long-term investment, resilience, affordability, and public value. So the framework, they recognize that achieving the universalization in a country like Brazil requires investment capacity. And we need both. We need the public and the private sectors to have this together. So in other words, the framework seeks that balance,
Wow.
So the public remains responsible for governance, regulation, planning, while the private actors can contribute with operational efficiency, innovation, management capacity, and access to capital. Okay. And I think the balance is essential because water systems are long-term systems. Yes. So if you optimize only for financial efficiency and ignore social environmental resilience, the model becomes unsustainable over time. But if you ignore investments, variability, and institutional predictability, universalization also becomes impossible.
I love it. I think you say that the question is not public versus private, but whether the institutional model is able to deliver that goal that you have, which is universal access. And in a way, I think it's about engineering of incentives, right? More than a dogmatic political decision. But now we go to the closing. Here, the question is, you, Ana, with all what you know, with all what you have experienced, if you had a magic wand and you could change one thing in the system to achieve universal access to water and sanitation, water security at large in this context of Brazil that, although it's already much more advanced than other countries, has some limited public resources, what would that be?
Well, this is a tricky question. Okay, I thought a lot about this question. And if I could change one thing, I would strengthen long-term institutional capacity and planning continuity. Because water and sanitation transformation requires investment that mature over decades. But the political and financial cycles are often very short-term. So one of the biggest challenges, I think, globally is creating the governance systems capable of sustaining long-term priorities beyond electoral cycles, and institutional fragmentation. Because ultimately, resilience is not only about infrastructure, it's also about institutional trust, coordination, the ability to align different actors around a shared vision for the future. So if I can change something, is strengthening the long-term institutional capacity and planning continuity. It's like with the change of the policy or the president or the side, if it's right, the sector remains, secure because we want to universalize, not do what for many years, unfortunately, globally, we see that is make the sanitation something that are used for politics. It will be something that is go across
political cycles. Okay, thank you so much. And I really enjoyed today.
Yeah,
I'm really thankful. I learned a lot. Thank you for listening to Investing in Regeneration. But before you go, if this conversation sparked new ideas for how we understand, plan, or finance projects, I invite you to take one small step today. Leave a rating and a review. It helps this podcast reach the people who are shaping decisions. And please share this episode with a policymaker, a planner, an investor, or anyone who has the agency to influence how projects are originated, designed, and financed. This is not just about spreading a podcast. It's about joining a quiet revolution, reimagining finance, and embracing a new investment paradigm that reconnects people, nature, and the economy, and places finance at the service of life.